Hello, my name is Tyler Marr, and this is my Grazing System podcast. Today, we will be discussing my rotational grazing proposal, the objectives of a rotational grazing system, the rotational grazing background, the plan and process of implementing a rotational grazing system, and the cost, benefits, and opportunities associated with rotational grazing. The photo in the slide shows a continuous grazed pasture on the left versus a rotationally grazed pasture on the right. My grazing system proposal is to implement a rotational grazing system to improve forage quality, increase forage production, and reverse the effects of a poorly managed pasture. In the following slides, I will explain how this can be accomplished with rotational grazing. The objective of a rotationally grazing system is to reverse the impact of overgrazing on rangelands. The picture in this slide shows a rotationally grazed pasture on the left and an overgrazed pasture on the right. You can see from the picture that the rotationally grazed pasture has improved species composition, increased forage production, and improved forage quality from regrowth. It also allows livestock a more balanced diet. When presented in a pasture, livestock will go from plant to plant, choosing the most palatable and nutritious first. Rotationally grazing with a system of paddocks forces the livestock to choose less palatable plants along with their more palatable plants, creating a more even diet and improving livestock gains and performance. Rotational grazing also provides more stable production during poor growing conditions. If these two pastures in the picture were presented in a drought condition, the rotationally grazed pasture would respond with more hardiness, with more leaf area above ground, as well as more biomass below ground and carbohydrate reserves in the roots. There is also decreased weed and erosion problems on a rotationally grazed piece. You can see the pasture on the right is starting to show bare spots and weed problems. And it also returns the rangeland to a more productive state. You can see that the rotationally grazed pasture is in a more natural state than the overgrazed pasture. The background of rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is a management intensive strategy. It takes a lot more time and effort to plan out your forages and move the cattle from paddock to paddock. It also maximizes forage growth stimulated by grazing. It encourages the vigor of desirable plants by forcing the livestock to eat not only the less nutritious plants but also the more nutritious plants in each paddock before moving on. The new growth stimulated by grazing is more nutritious and palatable. Cattle are rotated through a series of pastures, and each pasture is allowed a rest period after the cattle are rotated through for forage regrowth. This is the key to rotational grazing. Grazing will stimulate the new growth, and the rest period allows the forage to regrow before the cows come in and graze it off again. Increased grazing density gives the cattle a more even diet. It forces them to seek out the less palatable plants and give them a more consistent diet. The process of rotational grazing requires larger pastures to be divided into smaller paddocks. The picture on the right shows flexible grazing cells with portable fence inside a permanent fenced larger pasture. The creation of these grazing cells with this portable polywire fence creates a flexible and easy to use system that can be conformed to many configurations. In each paddock, cattle must be given access to water. If no water is present, water either needs to be hauled or a water source needs to be created. The cross-fencing system used within the larger pasture should allow for livestock to be easily moved. Move cattle every few days between the paddocks. This will allow rest for the other paddocks in the pasture and give them time to regrow as the others are being grazed. This rotation also creates more balanced nutrition for the livestock. The main cost of rotational grazing is increased management time, moving cattle from paddock to paddock, as well as creating a rotational grazing plan to utilize those paddocks. Fencing for subdividing may also be required. This can either be done with a portable fence, such as the polywire in the previous slide. The average cost for that would be about $1,300. In cross fencing, which is optional, you put a 2-wire permanent fence on quarter-mile sections through your pasture. This is a more expensive option, but allows cattle to be easily moved with the portable fence and costs $3,000. And the cattle also need to have access to a water source in each one of the paddocks. A lot of people create a circular pattern of grazing around a water source, like a pivot, and use a central water source. That is a good way to utilize an existing water source, but if you need other water sources, that is where it gets to be expensive with a $5,000 to $10,000 upgrade for your cattle. The benefits of rotational grazing include the ability to produce more forage. This not only occurs in the above ground leaf area, but also the below ground root and carbohydrate reserves. The picture in this slide shows a tall fescue plant on the left which is not grazed, a middle one which is rotationally grazed, and one on the right which is continuously overgrazed. You can see the dramatic differences in root and leaf area on the continuously overgrazed plant and the similarities between a non-grazed and a rotationally grazed plant. With rotational grazing, there is an improvement of species composition. This is due to the persistence of desirable plants and their ability to compete with the non-desirable plants in a rotationally grazing system. Rotational grazing also gives the producer the opportunity to stockpile forages. This allows him to let them rest during the growing season and come back to them at a later point in the year when other forages are not growing. It gives them control over grazing and browsing heists. When you're managing your pasture more frequently, you can prevent overgrazing by allowing more rest, like the picture in this slide. It also provides a more balanced nutritional diet for the cattle as they are grazing the fresh new growth, which is more nutritious and also forced to eat the less palatable plants with the more palatable plants, and this equates to an increased daily gain for cattle. The use of a rotational grazing system offers opportunities for continued management practices. A year-round grazing system can be developed with the use of stockpiled forages. Pastures are not grazed during the growing season and allowed to accumulate for use later in the fall or winter when nothing else is growing. This is the same concept as feeding hay during the winter to cattle. The picture in the slide shows a whole bunch of cattle gathered around a bell feeder, eating hay, and there's nice green grass for them to be grazing in the background. Rotational grazing can cut out the step of having to produce hay to feed your livestock during the winter. A calving season can be moved back to later in the spring to align the nutritional requirements of the cow during the growing season when she is calving, when her nutritional requirements are the highest. You can also evaluate your herd size to match the environment. Smaller cows will do better on a rotational grazing system. You're wanting to make your livestock and your grass work for you. If your cattle cannot be sustained year-round on a rotational grazing system, the cow size needs to be reduced. You can also manage your rangeland more intensively. You get more out of your grass by rotational grazing because of the increased grazing densities provided by putting more cattle in a smaller area on your paddocks. And you can change your rangeland from summer to winter use, as I talked about when stockpiling forages. Today we have addressed the proposal, objectives, background, plan and process, cost, opportunities, and benefits of a rotational grazing system. A well-managed pasture is the key to a successful and profitable operation, and rotational grazing can allow that to be accomplished.